Hello everyone and welcome back. Whoops, I forgot to turn on one of my backup machines here. Sorry, bear with me 1 second here. Welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and Amir Sashem today we'll be learning Daf Kuftes Zayin Amud Aleph. I had hoped to cover a significant part of Daf Kuftes Zayin Amud Aleph yesterday. However, I wasn't able to. I had to cut the share off a little bit early. However, today we'll be learning Mirz Hashem Daf Kuftes Zayin Amud Aleph. But before we begin really with Kuftes Zayin Amud Aleph, I want to take a moment to go back to something we covered yesterday and do a little show and tell, because I think it would be very, very helpful in our understanding of the topic at hand. So, the Mechaber yesterday in Sif Aleph, Siman Tafresh Mem Ches Sif Aleph, spoke about an Esrog that is Yavesh, an Esrog that is dried out. And the Mechaber told us that the way to test an Esrog, to find out if it is indeed Yavesh, is to take a needle, here we have a needle and thread, and to pass it through the Esrog. At least that was our instant understanding of the words of the Mechaber. The Mechaber told us, he said, Yavor by Machat, you pass a Machat, a needle, through the Esrog, uboy chut, and on the needle you have a thread. Ve'em yesh by lecha, and if there is moisture within the Esrog, ye'ra bachut, you will see it on the thread. So again, the quick and easy way to understand the Mechaber is like so. You take said needle, you push it into the Esrog, like I'm doing here. You push it through, push it straight across to the other side. Let me see if I have something here that I could assist in the pushing. Okay, here we have one of my trusty rulers. We take the needle, we push it through. As you can see here now, we have the needle, right? Here's the thread coming out the back end of the needle, and we have the thread pierced all the way through the Esrog. And now we take the needle, pull it out the other side. Easier said than done, but we're doing it. Okay, I now have pulled the needle out, and I'm now pulling the thread through the Esrog. Okay, I don't want to lose my thread from the hole on the needle. Okay, we pull the thread clear through the Esrog, and now, before I do anything else, I'm going to feel the thread. And sure enough, there is some dampness on the thread. I must admit, there is much less dampness on the thread than I would have expected, which is very interesting to me, because I almost feel like, according to the test of the Mechaber, it almost feels to me like this Esrog, which as you can see is still nice and yellow, it almost feels to me like this would constitute an Esrog which is Yavesh, because I gotta tell you that certainly the words of the Mechaber are, V'im yesh b'lecha, if there is moisture in the Esrog, yera'eh bachut, it will be seen on the thread. I gotta tell you, I don't see any moisture on this thread. When I first felt it, I thought that I was feeling a little dampness. Now I'm really questioning to myself whether I feel any dampness at all. I certainly don't feel or detect any dampness on the needle. So that's very interesting to me. This is the very first time I've ever done this. But it's almost very interesting to me that this is an Esrog, which certainly does not look like an Esrog Yavesh, and yet when I do the Mechaber's test, it would almost feel to me like it's Yavesh. All right, we'll have to maybe think about that in the future. Now, the Mishnah Berurah in Eis Katan Gimel yesterday brought up the following question that the Achronim asked. We're going to see in today's shir, we're going to start discussing Esrogim that have holes in them. And we're going to learn about the Esrog Shenikev Nekev Mefulash, an Esrog that has a hole that goes straight through. And according to the first opinion that's brought down in Sif Beis, if you have an Esrog that has a hole that goes straight through the Esrog, even if the Esrog is not chosar, even if nothing is missing, it's not that any flesh of the Esrog was dug out in order to make the hole, rather when you take a needle and you push it in, it doesn't remove any substance from the Esrog, it just kind of compacts the flesh of the esrog to the two sides and it passes through. But the Deir Rishona in Sif Beis rules that if you have a hole that goes all the way through, even if it's not chasar, even if it's not missing anything, that renders the esrog puzzle. And therefore, the Mishnah Berurah brought down the kasha that the Achronim asked on the Mechaber. How could you say that the thing to do is to test the esrog by passing a needle and a thread through the esrog? If you pass a needle and a thread through the esrog, you're going to passel the esrog, because now the esrog has a nekev mefulish. Now it has a hole that goes all the way through. And we saw yesterday two possible tirutzim to this kasha. The first teretz was the kasha of the teretz of the Magen Avram. Magen Avram had a very interesting approach. He suggested, instead, what the Mechaber means is, instead of taking the needle the way we did it, pushing the pointy side of the needle into the esrog and drawing it out on the other side the way we did, he said what the Mechaber really means is like this. We take the back end of the needle that has the thread attached to it, and we push that into the esrog like so. By doing that, we have now penetrated the esrog with the end of the needle, with the eye of the needle, and with the thread. Now we pull it back out, and we check that little bit of thread and see if there's any moisture on that little bit of thread. That was the answer of the Magen Avram. The Berurah Yaakov had a different teretz that he was basing on the words of the Taz. And before we go into the Berurah Yaakov's teretz, I want to show you the cross-section of an esrog. As you can see, I already cut this esrog open. So, if we cut an esrog open, if too much light, let me see if I can get the camera to focus on that. That way it will dim the lighting a little. Okay. Not really. Let me see if I dim the lighting. Okay, that's a little bit better. Here we have the esrog cut open. You know what? I think I have to move one of my lights. Oh, okay, that helps. Here we have an esrog. Now, the esrog has the yellow skin on the outside, the outer yellow skin. That skin is actually very, very thin. Inside of that, we have the white rind. This white rind over here that goes all the way around on the inside of the esrog, which is actually quite thick. In this esrog, it's actually a little bit thinner than a lot of other esrogim that I have seen. Then inside here, we have the flesh of the esrog with the chadrei hazera, the little seed compartments. Actually over here, if you could pick it up on the camera, there's an actual seed. Let me see if I can get the camera to focus on that. Yeah, there's a seed over here. I just pushed it out with my finger. So that's the chadrei hazera, the little compartments of where the seeds are. Now, what the Berurah Yaakov suggested is like this. He said a nekev mefulish is if we pierce the esrog on one side and bring it through the width of the esrog. And the Berurah Yaakov said that would constitute a nekev mefulish, even, let's say, if we did it all the way up here. If we went up here and we pierced the esrog with the needle through its width over here, we're above the chadrei hazera. So we're never going to pierce the chadrei hazera, but we're going to go all the way through the width of the esrog. That, said the Berurah Yaakov, would constitute a nekev mefulish. But what he suggested the Mechaber may mean is like this. Let's say we go into the esrog down here, and we push the needle up through the esrog from down here. Okay, I don't know that I'm going to be able to pull it out from the top because it's just jutting out here. But what we've done now is created a situation where the needle is going up through the length, through the height of the esrog on one side, but it's not going through. That, the Berurah Yaakov suggested, might not be a nekev mefulish, and possibly that is what the Mechaber meant when the Mechaber wanted to give that test. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this now at the outset of today's shir is because by showing you the Esrog and opening up the Esrog and showing you the interior of the Esrog, we begin to get a clearer understanding of the parts and the various sections of the Esrog as we go further. Now, with that introduction, let's pick up on Kuf Tes Vav Amid Beis, Siman Tafresh Mem Ches Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber, Esrig Shenikev Nekev Mefulish, an Esrig that has a hole that goes all the way through, Kol Shehu, even if it's tiny, Puzzle, that Esrig is puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Vav, Kol Shehu Puzzle, an Esrig that has a hole that is Mefulish. Let's remember what the word Mefulish means. We're used to the word Mefulish back in the day when we were learning Hilchas Erevin. And we had a Mavui Mefulish. We have a Mavui Mefulish and a Mavui She'enoi Mefulish. A Mavui Mefulish is an open Mavui. It's a Mavui that's only closed on the two long sides. But you could walk straight through the Mavui. You go in the entrance of the Mavui on one side, and you go straight through between the two side walls of the Mavui, and you could continue straight out the other end. That's an open Mavui, a Mavui Mefulish. A Mavui She'ena Mefulish is closed on three sides. It's essentially a dead end, a cul-de-sac. You could go in on one end, but you cannot go through. Over here, we're talking about an Esrog Shenikev Nekev Mefulish. A Nekev Mefulish, the easy way to understand it, is a hole that goes all the way through. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Vav, this is puzzle, according to this day of Rishona, afilu einoi chaser mina esrig klal. Even if there's nothing missing from the esrig, no flesh has been removed from the esrig. Kegoin shenikev al yedei machat. For example, like the cases that we have been discussing, where you pass a needle through the esrig. If you go all the way through, that's a nekev mefulish, and it's loy chasar klum. It's not missing anything. But according to this Dei Rishona here in Siv Beis, that would be a pasala esrig. So again, let's go into the Mechaber, and I'll read again from the beginning of Siv Beis. Esrig shenikev nekev mefulish, an esrig that has a hole that goes all the way through, kol shehu, even if it is tiny, even if it is minute. Pasal, according to this opinion, that esrig is pasal. Vishe'enoi mefulish, if the hole is not mefulish. It doesn't go all the way through the esrig. It's a hole in the side of the esrig, but it terminates. It doesn't go all the way through. Vishe'enoi mefulish, if it's a hole that doesn't go all the way through, then the Mechaber says, according to this opinion, the halacha depends. Im haya ki isar, if the size of the hole is the size of an isar was a specific coin, and we're going to have to talk more about what exactly this size is. Im haya ki isar, if the hole in the esrig is the size of an isar, then pasal, then the esrig is pasal. Now, again, says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Zayin, what are we speaking about here? We're speaking about a hole that's not mefulish, a hole that does not go all the way through, but it's the size of an isar. But is the esrig missing anything? Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Zayin, no. Im haya ki isar, if the hole is the size of an isar, afilu ein by chisaron, even if the esrig is not missing anything. Kegoin, for example, shetachav by yosed rachav. Maybe what happened was, you took a big peg. Over here I have a screw that has a pretty big head on it. If I took that and I somehow pressed it into the esrig so that I made a hole, and that hole is the size of an isar, trying to think if I have something else here. Yeah, you know what I could use? I could use the tip of a pen, right? Let me see if I have a fairly cheapy pen over here. Okay, I think this pen, no, this is still a good pen. I have a pen that's relatively out of ink. If not, I will just use something else. Oh, I do have something else. I have something perfect. Okay, this is actually a drywall anchor. This will make a mean hole in an esrog. So if I take this and I push it into the esrog, look at that. Okay. So I have now made a sizable hole in the esrog, but it's not mafulish. It doesn't go all the way through. It goes in a little bit, and that's it. If that hole is the size of an isar, then the esrog is puzzle, even if it's not missing anything. I did not remove any flesh. I stuck something in. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah said. Even if the esrog is not missing anything. For instance, you took a wide peg and you shoved it in. If it's the size of an isar, then it will be puzzle. And the Mishnah Berurah says, V'im hanekev meruba, let's say the hole that you make is square, it's not round. Or it's oval. Ryan, we look at it and we measure it, ikad ma'aglasla. If you would convert this into a round hole, if you would convert the area of the shape that you made into a round area, heviki isar, if it would be the size of an isar, then puzzle, then the esrog would be puzzle. Continues the Bechaber on the bottom line, v'im chasar kol shehu, and certainly if the esrog is missing anything, even a tiny amount, puzzle, the esrog would be puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'im chasar kol shehu, if the esrog is missing anything, v'tzayin loymar, the im chasar, if you did remove something from the esrog, az afilu hanekev hu katan b'yoser, then even if the hole is tiny, duhu kol shehu. So according to the Day Rishona, if you took a pin and you made a hole in the esrog, and you did it by picking out the esrog, and you removed a tiny bit of flesh, then the esrog would be puzzle. Az afilu hanekev hu katan b'yoser, even if it's a tiny hole, duhu kol shehu, mamsha kol shehu, gam ken puzzle, the esrog would be puzzle. So if I want to wrap up the Day Rishona over here in Sif Beis, what the Day Rishona says is like this. You have a hole in the esrog, it depends. If it's mafulish, if it goes all the way through the esrog, all bets are off. It doesn't matter how big it is. It doesn't matter if it's missing anything or if it's chasar, if it's not chasar. If you have a hole that's mafulish, this esrog is puzzle. All bets are off. If it's a hole that's not mafulish, then the Day Rishona says it depends. How big is first? How big is the hole? If the hole is the size of an isar, the size of a coin, forget it. The esrog is puzzle. It doesn't matter if it's chasar, doesn't matter if it's not chasar. It has a hole. It's the size of an isar. The esrog is puzzle. But what if the hole is not the size of an isar? What if the hole is a tiny hole? If the hole is a tiny hole, then it depends. If it's chasar, it's puzzle. If it's not chasar, so it's a tiny hole, and it's not chasar, then the esrog could still be kosher. That's the Day Rishona. Continues the Mishnah Berurah on Kufteh Zayin Amud Aleph. V'ayin b'maimer Mordechai. It's interesting to me that the Mishnah Berurah puts this line over here. I would think that really this line should be a little bit further on in the Mishnah Berurah after we learn about the Day Shniya, but he puts it over here. He says, V'ayin b'maimer Mordechai, look at the Sefer Maimer Mordechai, Shehiskim, who concludes and agrees the le'inyan Yom Tov Sheni, when it comes to the second day Yom Tov in Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath, Shaper Dami, it would be okay levarech alav to make a bracha on an esrog kol she'enoi mefulish, as long as the hole is not mefulish, ve'enoi chasar b'ki iser, and it's not chasar the size of an isar. Now, according to the Day Rishona that we just learned, this esrog would be puzzle, because the Day Rishona just told us if you have a nekev that's not mefulish, even if it's chasar, a tiny drop, even if it's a tiny hole and it's chasar, a tiny drop, that esrog is puzzle, because according to the Day Rishona, chasar, there are two things that all bets are off, according to the Day Rishona. If the nekev is mefulish, the esrog is puzzle. I don't care what. I don't care chasar. I don't care how big the hole is. If it's mefulish, it's puzzle. The other thing that, according to the Day Rishona, is all bets are off, is if the esrog is chasar. Even if it's only chasar a kolshu, even if it's only chasar a tiny amount. So you have a tiny hole, and it's not mafulish, but it's chasar, all bets are off. That esrog is puzzle. So according to the Day Rishina, this scenario that the Mishnah Berurah just described from the Maimon Mordechai, which is an esrog that has a hole that's not mafulish, but it is chasar, but it's only chasar a tiny amount. It's chasar less than an isar. Says the Maimon Mordechai, on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius, you could make a bracha on such an esrog. Now, according to the Day Rishina, that esrog is puzzle. But according to the Day Shnia, we're going to see now that esrog would be kosher. And since it's kosher, according to the Day Shnia, even though we're usually machmer like the Day Rishina, since this esrog would be kosher, according to the Day Shnia, on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius, we would use and make a bracha on such an esrog. So that was the Day Rishina. Now let's go to the top of Kuf Tez Zayin Amud Aleph, and let's see the Day Shnia. Says the Mechaber. V'yesh Oimrim, and there are those that say, and this is the Rabbeinu Chananel, so to the Ravid, this is the a more kula dikashita. V'yesh Oimrim, some say, b'nekev mefulish, if you have a nekev mefulish, a hole that goes all the way through. So according to the Day Rishina, nekev mefulish, all bets are off. That esrog is puzzle. Not so according to the Day Shnia. V'yesh Oimrim, the Day Shnia says, the gab b'nekev mefulish, even by a nekev mefulish, but inon chisaron mashu. In order to passel the esrog, there has to be a chisaron. There has to be something lacking from the esrog. Some material has to have been removed and lost from the esrog. But if you just take a needle and pass the needle straight through the esrog, according to the Day Shnia, that esrog would still be kosher. Visha eino mefulish, and if the hole does not go all the way through, then again, the Day Shnia is also more makel than the Day Rishina. According to the Day Rishina, if it's eino mefulish, so it depends. If the hole is the size of an isar, then the esrog is possible, even if it's not chasar. If the hole is smaller than an isar, then it depends. If it's chasar, even a tiny amount, esrog is possible. If it's not chasar, it could be kosher. Says the Day Shnia, no. V'she'eino mefulish, if the hole doesn't go all the way through, then when is the esrog to be possible? Only b'chisaron ki'isr. Only if the esrog is chasar, it has to be missing material. And how much does it have to be missing? It has to be missing material the size of an isar. Says the Mishnah Berurah's cotton test. V'yesh Oimrim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's at the heart of this yesh Oimrim? Sevir lahu, these Rishonim hold, the tarti l'reyasa be'inan, that in order to passel an esrog, you need 2 strikes against the esrog. The Day Rishina held, you could passel an esrog even with 1 strike. For example, if the nekev is mefulish, that's it. The esrog is possible. I don't care if it's chasar, I don't care if it's not chasar. So too, if the esrog is chasar, even a tiny amount, I don't care how much it's chasar, I don't care how big the hole is, I don't care if it's mefulish. If it's chasar, the esrog is possible. So the Day Rishina will passel an esrog with 1 strike. The Day Shnia holds you need 2 strikes. Svirilu detarti l'reyasa be'inan. These Rishonim hold that you need 2 strikes against the esrog to passel it. Mefulish v'chisaron. You need the strike of mefulish. The hole has to go all the way through, and you need it to be chisaron. The beloy chisaron, because this shita holds, if the esrog is not missing anything, kosher b'chal gavni. You'll never passel an esrog if it's not chasar. Even an nekev mefulish, even if it goes all the way through, if it's not chasar, the esrog is not possible. So the beloy chisaron kosher b'chal gavni. Unless the esrog is chasar, it's missing material, you're never going to passel the esrog. Ela b'yesh chisaron, when the esrog is missing material, if it is chasar, yesh chiluk, then it depends. De'im hu mefulish, if the hole goes all the way through, puzzle, the esrog is puzzle, afilu b'chisaron kolshu. Even if it's a chisaron kolshu, even if there's only a tiny amount of material missing. Ube'enai mefulish, if the hole is not mefulish, if the hole doesn't go all the way through, then dafka kishachasar b'ki'isr. Then you'll only passel the esrog if it's chasar so much that it's chasar, it's missing material the size of a coin. Now we shouldn't get confused. This Mishnah Berurah's cotton test began with the words detarti l'reyas be'inan, that we need 2 strikes, mefulish and chesaron. Now, based on the words that the Mishnah Berurah we just read, you don't always need both strikes. In the second case that the Mishnah Berurah just gave, where we're going to passel the esrog according to the Dei Shnia, we don't have both strikes. We have a hole that's not mefulish. It's only chasar, but it's chasar ki'iser. It's so chasar, it's missing so much material, it's missing material the size of an iser. That esrog will be passel according to the Dei Shnia, even though you don't have both strikes. You don't have mefulish. But if it's chasar, and it's chasar ki'iser, we'll passel the esrog. So the beginning of Eis Katan Tes is a little confusing. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, "V'kaimalon lahachmir." We paskin lamaisa lechumra, and we try to paskin like the Dei Rishayna, that if it's mefulish, it's passel even if it's not chasar. If it's chasar, it's passel even b'kolshu, even if it's only chasar a tiny amount and it's not mefulish. Zulas b'shasat chak, unless we're faced with a shasat chak, k'moshe kasav Ramah achar kach, like we're going to see the Ramah is going to write right now. Okay, now we're going to go to the second line in the Shulchan Aruch, and we're going to see the Ramah. Says the Ramah, V'nagu, we do have a minig, lahakshir hanikavim, to kasher an esrog, to say that an esrog is kosher, with the holes, hanikavim, shenasu b'ilon, that happened to the esrog on the tree, al yedei kaitzim, because of thorns on the tree. So the Ramah says over here, there is a metzias, the esrog tree sometimes has thorny protrusions on it, and sometimes the esrog is sitting on the tree, and it leans against one of those natural protrusions on the tree, and the esrog gets a blemish, the esrog gets a hole because of its contact with that thorn. So the Ramah says, in the Nagu we have a minig, lahakshir, to render kosher, hanekavim, the holes, shenasu be'ilan, that happen on the tree, al yedei kaitzim, because of the thorn-like protrusions, afal pi sheyesh bahem chesaron, even though there's actually a chesaron, there's actually something dug out of the esrog because of that hole. And the rationale for saying that this is kosher, says the Ramah, shezeu derech gidilosam, because this is the natural way that the esrog grew. The esrog grew on the tree, it got the hole on the tree because of the tree. So that's the derech gidel of the esrog, and therefore we don't look at that as a blemish that will passel the esrog. However, the Ramah now is going to give a very important caveat to this exception, and the Mishnah Berurah will spell it out even more clearly. Says the Ramah, miu, however, as the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain, when the Ramah said that there's a minig that we say that the esrog is kosher if it got a hole while it was on the tree because of the kaitzim, because of the thorns, that's only, explains the Mishnah Berurah, when the esrog actually healed itself. You look at the esrog and you see that there's a blemish on the esrog. There's like an indentation on the esrog. That makes it clear that this is a blemish that happened to the esrog while the esrog was on the tree. But if you look at it, you'll see that the esrog healed itself. It filled in, flesh grew in inside that hole, and the skin of the esrog is intact. So you look at the esrog and you see a blemish, you see an indentation in the esrog, but you see that it's healed over. The skin of the esrog grew in, and underneath that skin, flesh obviously filled in under the esrog. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's what the Ramah meant when the Ramah said that we have a minig to say that an esrog that got a hole from a thorn while it's on the tree is kosher in that case. And that's why the Ramah now gives a caveat. And he says like this, miu, however, if you look at the esrog and you see that the skin of the esrog is not intact by that blemish, and you see that it did not fill in with flesh, then pasal l'sfara harishayna, then according to the day Rishayna, according to the first opinion here in Sif Beis, this Esrog would be pasal, afal pisha ena foolish, even though the hole doesn't go all the way through. Why? Because it's chasar. It might only be chasar kolshu, but it is chasar. The thorn made a hole where it actually dug out flesh, and the hole never properly filled back in. So in that case, the esrog is chasar. And according to the Dei Rishayna, if you have a hole where the esrog is chasar, even if it's chasar kolshu, even if it's only chasar a tiny amount, the esrog is puzzle. Continues the Ramah, Ubishasat Chak, in a pressing circumstance, Yesh lahakal kisfara ha'achrona, we could be makel, like the more kuladik second opinion, lahachshir chisaron sheina ke'iser ve'eno nekev mafulish. And we could say that an esrog is kosher even if it has a hole where it is chasar, but it's only chasar a tiny amount. It's not chasar like an isar. It's not missing an amount of material equal to the size of the isar coin, ve'eno nekev mafulish, and it's not a hole that goes all the way through. So the Ramah rules, in a shasat chak, this is only esrog you could get. They're not importing any esrogim. We have one esrog for the whole city. The only esrog that we have is an esrog that has a hole, and it is chasar, but it's a small hole, and it's not chasar the size of an isar. So according to the Dei Shnia, according to the second opinion here in Sif Beis, that esrog would be kosher. So the Shasat Chak, we could be makel like the Dei Shnia. Boy, what a mouthful. Now let's go to Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Yud, where we're discussing the hole in the esrog that was made by a thorn on the tree. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Eis Katan Yud, Afa Pishi Yesh Bem Chesaron, even though this esrog is missing material. Ritzayna Loimar. What the Ramah means to say is, Shenira Lipa'amim Be'esrog, sometimes we could see on an esrog, Shahaya by Nekev Ba'oidai B'mechuber, that this esrog had a hole in it while it was still attached to the tree. Ella, however, we don't see really a hole now because shenikram olav oyer, because the skin healed itself and formed a new skin over the area where there was a hole. Ubasar, shenikram olav oru basar milamala, because flesh and new skin covered over where that hole was. Bazeh yesh lahatir. The Ramah says you could be matir that. Even though the thorn made a hole in the esrog, and that hole was chasar, it dug out material, since later on the esrog filled in the hole with new flesh and covered it over with new skin, so now, even though you see this strange indentation in the esrog, which makes it clear that once upon a time there was a nekev and it was chasar, we could be matir that esrog. Aval, however, Imanu Royim, if we see Shaloi Nikram, that it did not skin over, it didn't heal itself, Elayesham Nekev Chisaron, but there still is a hole, and there still is chisur, it still is missing material, then even though this hole happened derech gidul, it happened naturally, the natural way the esrog grows while it's still on the tree, it's still puzzle. V'zehu shesiem, and this is what the Ramah means when he gives the caveat, mihu imroyeh. If we see that the hole is still there, and it's still chasar, and the esrog did not heal, and it didn't fill in, then it's puzzle. And the Mishnah Berurah says, v'hamoinam, the people, toyin bekach, they make a mistake in this halacha. Shesoivrin, they think, sheyesh kula, that there's a big kula in the halacha of an esrog, kishanasa hanekev al yidei koitzim. They think, they see an esrog with a hole in it, and they say, nah, that's okay, because it happened on the tree. No, if there's still a blemish, which is a hole, and it's chesaron, and it's not skinned over, I don't care if it happened on the tree, that esrog is still puzzle. If you look at it and you see that the hole did not get filled in, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you look at it and you don't know, you're not a botanist, you don't know how to tell, I don't know, did this hole get healed up or not? In a basar kayim, azlina lekula, you could go lekula. Kevin Chad. The Achroida Svirlu Hafila Bavada Yesh Chesaron Kosher. Kol she'enim Mefulish ve'ena Chesaron b'Ki'isr. The Mishnah Berurah says if you have a suffix, you could go Lekula. Why? Because let's say the hole taka did not fill in. According to the day of Shnia, it's still kosher. You have a hole that's not Mefulish, and it's chasar, but it's not chasar Ki'isr. So according to the day of Shnia, that lulav is kosher. That the esrog is kosher. So says the Mishnah Berurah, you could rely on the day of Shnia if you have a suffix. Shaper nismach hazeh b'suffix l'chalapachas. Va'afilu im suffix lo yishema higia pilush hanekev ad chadrei azera. Let's say you look at this hole in the esrog, and it seems to be very deep, and you're wondering, maybe when the kites made a hole in this esrog, it went so deep into the esrog that it went all the way till the chadrei azera. It went all the way into the flesh inside the esrog where the seeds are. Now we're going to see that there's a machlokes what constitutes a nekev mefulish. We've been learning until now that a nekev mefulish is a hole that goes all the way through. But there is a shita that says that if a hole goes through from the outside of the esrog all the way to the chadrei azera. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to push it in here, and I'm not going to go all the way out the other side of the esrog. But I don't know if you could see on the you can see on the camera now. I stuck the needle through over here, and you can see it coming out from the chadrei hazera over here. So this needle went from the outside, there it is piercing the outside, and it went all the way through to the chadrei hazera. There are shittas that hold that is enough to be considered a nekev mefulish. That, the truth is, even less than that. If it just went from the outside to the chadrei hazera. What I did is it mamish pierced right through the chadrei hazera. But the point is, it didn't come out the other side of the esrog. It didn't go clean through the esrog. There are shittas that hold that alone constitutes a nekev mefulish. So what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. Let's say you see this hole in the esrog that was made by a kites, and you have a suffix. You know, that looks like a very deep hole. It might have gone all the way to the chadrei hazera, but I don't know. Without cutting the esrog open, I don't know. And I can't cut the esrog open if I want to use it on sukkahs. So you have such a suffix. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even in that case, I'm going to read again from the Ois Cotton Yud Dalet for the Shar HaTzion over here. 3 lines down in the Mishnah Berurah. 3 of the wide lines down in the Mishnah Berurah. Va'afilu im suffix loy, even if you have a suffix, shema higia pilush hanekev, maybe the hole, the opening of the hole went ad chadrei hazera, all the way till the chadrei hazera, gam ken yesh lahachshir. You could still say that esrog is kosher. Shekol she'enoi baruch lanu shehigia ad chadrei hazera, as long as we don't know for certain that it got all the way to the chadrei hazera, yesh lismaich, we could rely al divrei ha'imrim, on the opinions that say sha'afilu ibigia lechadrei hazera. Even if the hole did reach the chadrei hazera, ain't a nikra nekev mefulish, it's still not called a nekev mefulish. Ve'ein a paisel elim kein yesh b'chesaron, and therefore, since that does not constitute a nekev mefulish, it doesn't pass the esrog unless there's chesaron. So we could rely on that shita. Eis Cotton Yud Beis says to Mishnah Berurah, the Ramah said in a Shas HaTchak we could paskin like the Svara Achroina, Kasvara Achroina lahakshir, and says the Mishnah Berurah, not only can we rely in a Shas HaTchak on the more kuladik Dei Shnia, the second opinion over here in Sif Beis, says the Mishnah Berurah, even ulavarich alav, we can even make a bracha on this esrog. So again, we have this esrog, and we have it's got a hole, it's not mefulish, it's got a hole, and it is chasar, but it's not chasar b'ki'isr. It's not missing an amount of material equal to the size of an Isser coin. So according to the Day Rishona, it's puzzle because it's chasar. According to the Day Shnia, it's kosher because even though it's chasar, it's not chasar ki'isr. The Ramah said, Shas HaTchak, you could rely on that opinion. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Yud Beis, not only could you rely on that opinion to take that esrog to be yotzei the mitzvah, you could even make a bracha on that esrog. Wow. This is quite complicated and quite a mouthful. I hope I'm giving it over very clearly in the time that we have. Eis Cotton Gimel says the Mechaber, mefulish. We're talking all about this esrog that has a hole that's mefulish. And until now, we keep on saying that the simple understanding of a nekev mefulish is that it goes all the way through the esrog from one side straight through to the other side. Of course, not so simple. Says the Mechaber Sif Gimel, mefulish. When it comes to an esrog that has a nekev that's mefulish, we have a machlokes. What that means? Yesh befarshim kipshutai. There are those that understand this. As the Bahag, the Rif, the Ravid, they understand this very simply. Dahainu shenikev mitzadzeh l'tzadzeh. It means that there's a hole that goes all the way through the esrog from one side to the other. That's a nekev mefulish. However, v'yesh befarshim, but there are those rishonim. You have a Rosh who quotes a Yerushalmi. You have Rashi. You have the Rashi. I thought Rashi, but no, the Berurah says the Ri. And the Ran, v'yesh befarshim, there are those that say, shekevon shenikev ad chadrei azera. If the hole goes until the chadrei hazera. So here's my needle. If the hole goes into the esrog, and it goes until, see if I could use something. Let's pretend this is the needle. It's a lot easier to see. So if the hole, if the hole goes from the outside and it goes until the chadrei hazera, it doesn't go deep into the chadrei hazera. It goes till the chadrei hazera. There are those that say v'yesh befarshim shekevin shenikev ad chadrei hazera. If it's punctured, if it's penetrated until the chadrei hazera, shehagarinim b'soichai, where the seeds are inside the esrog, mikri mefulish. That is already called a nekev mefulish. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud Gimel. Shenikev mitzadzeh l'tzadzeh. The simple way to understand nekev mefulish is a hole that goes all the way through. Sha'al zeh moira shem mefulish. That would be the simple way to understand the terminology mefulish. Kimoi mavli mefulish. What's a mavli mefulish? A mavli mefulish is a mavli that's opened on both sides. You can walk all the way through. So a nekev mefulish by an esrog, the easy way to understand it is the hole goes all the way through from one side to the other. That's the first opinion. However, as Katan Yud Daled, we have another opinion, v'yesh befarshim, that it means ad chadrei hazera. If the puncture goes all the way until the chadrei hazera, that's called a nekev mefulish. Why would that be the case? So the Mishnah Berurah explains. Taimam, the rationale of this opinion is shahaklipa ha'aveh, the thick rind. That's that thick white rind inside the esrog. The lighting is really getting me messed up over here. This white rind, it goes all the way around. That rind, taimam, shahaklipa ha'aveh, the thick rind, hamakefes es chadrei hazera, that surrounds the chadrei hazera, eina nechsheves im chadrei hazera l'davar echad. The question over here is, how do we look at the inside, the interior of the esrog? Is the interior of the esrog all considered one section of the esrog, so that the thin outer yellow peel is one section of the esrog, and then the interior is another section? Is that the way we look at it? This shita says no. Elahi nechsheves ledavar b'fnei atzmai le'inyan zeh. This shita says the white rind is considered its own independent section of the esrog. The kevan shenikva kula mitzad echad, and since the rind is completely penetrated, you put in a needle on the outside of the esrog, it penetrated into the rind, and it came out the other side of the rind. That's mefulish. Not mefulish from one side of the esrog to the other side of the esrog, but it's mefulish from where it penetrated the rind until the chadrei hazera, where it exited the rind. That's called mefulish. It's mefulish in the rind, and that's why it's called mefulish. The kevan shenikva kfula mitzad echad, since on one side it is completely mefulish, it penetrated the rind on the outside of the esrog, and it went all the way through the rind until the chadrei hazera, harei zeh nekev mefulish. That is called a nekev mefulish. V'alkein, therefore, af al pi shechadrei hazera v'tzad hasheni shel esrog nisharu shleimim, even though you didn't penetrate the whole chadrei hazera, you just went from the outside through the rind until the chadrei hazera. But the chadrei hazera are intact, and certainly the other side of the esrog is still intact. So you came in over here, you went through the rind till the Chadrei Azera. But the Chadrei Azera and the whole other side of the Esrog are still completely intact. Still and all, that is called V'alkein, Afapisha Chadrei Azera, Tzadishedi Shel Esrog, B'shar Shleimim, Harez a puzzle, the Esrog is puzzle. Ul'inyan halacha, when it comes to the halacha l'maisa, says the Mishnah Berurah, Yesh lahachmer kasvara ha'achroina, we should try to be machmer like the second opinion here in Siv Gimel, that even if you don't go all the way through the Esrog, you just go through the outer peel, through the rind until the Chadrei Azera, that would be called a nekev mefulish, according to the day Achroina here in Siv Gimel, and according to the day Rishona in Siv Beis, if there's a nekev mefulish, the Esrog is puzzle, even if it's not chasar. So we take the chumrah of the Ramah in Siv Beis. The Ramah said we should go l'chumrah and we should follow the day Rishona in Siv Beis. Now we're going l'chumrah in Siv Gimel and we're following the day Achroina in Siv Gimel. So what constitutes a nekev mefulish? If you just went through the rind until the Chadrei Azera. And according to the day Rishona in Siv Beis, you have a nekev mefulish, the Esrog is puzzle, even if it's not chasar. Aval, however, says the Mishnah Berurah b'shas Chak, in a pressing circumstance, she'iev shalimtzay Esrog acher, you can't find another Esrog. Yesh lismach hasfara harishona, we could rely on the svara harishona here in Siv Gimel, that nekev mefulish is only if it goes all the way through the Esrog, or mutar levarich al Esrog zeh, and therefore you would be allowed to make a bracha on this Esrog where the puncture is only from the outside until the Chadrei Azera. Ubefrat, and certainly, heiche she'ena chasa klum, if there's no chisaron, if there's no material missing from the Esrog. Kigon she'nikev ayidei machat, so for instance, with a hole that came about from the puncture of a needle, the yesh bazeh svek sveka, here we would have a double suffix. Shema halacha kayesh omer maniskar b'Siv Beis. Then we could rely on the day shnia in Siv Beis, that the Esrog is not possible because it's not chasar, and we could rely on the day Rishona in Siv Gimel, that this is not called a nekev mefulish because it doesn't go all the way through. So the gamba mefulish tafka kishiyesh chisar. Okay. Ice cut tesvav mefulish. The Mechaber said that according to the day Achroina here in Siv Gimel, if the hole goes until the Chadrei Azera, that's called mefulish. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'im nikva klipa ha'ava mitzad zeh l'tzad zeh shaloi keneged Chadrei Azera. Let's say the rind is penetrated from one end to the other end, either above the Chadrei Azera or below the Chadrei Azera. So you have a puncture, but it never encountered the Chadrei Azera at all. Zeh mikri mefulish, that is certainly called mefulish, bein l'dei rishona or bein l'dei shnia. It doesn't matter the day Rishona or the day Shnia. Both would agree that's mefulish. In other words, our old question over here is, what's called mefulish when we're dealing with the level down here where the Chadrei Azera are involved? But let's say up here where we're above the Chadrei Azera, or down here where we're below the Chadrei Azera, if you went clean through the Esrog, that would definitely be called mefulish according to the day Rishona and according to the Deya Shnia. Okay, we're already a little bit long, so we're going to stop over here with Siv Daled. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu should say Yeshua's and first Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the BS Girl Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.